to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. Well, as we spend increasingly more and more time chatting with one another through screens and text messages, and less time in face-to-face communication, we're losing an important 21st century skill. Perhaps the most important 21st century skill, and that's how to sustain a conversation with someone, even if you disagree with them. Now, we've all had great conversations before. You know the feeling. You walk away feeling uplifted, motivated, inspired. You feel like you've made a real connection or that you've been perfectly understood. We all have so much to learn from one another, but as our politics and our opinions become increasingly more polarized, we very much lost sight of this. Now, there's no reason we can't be having more authentic, difficult, and yet civilized conversations in our lives. In fact, our health, our happiness, and our most fundamental relationships depend on this. Whether you're looking to make a connection, learn something new, negotiate your salary, or get what you want in an adversarial situation, our panel of experts tonight are going to help you get a little bit closer to achieving all of those things through the lost art of conversation. First, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Harry. Jeff helps companies create psychologically safe workspaces through the use of play. Jeff has worked with Google, Microsoft, Southwest Airlines, Adobe, the NFL, Amazon, Facebook, and many others, helping their staff to infuse more play in the day-to-day. For his work, Jeff was selected by Bamboo HR and Engagedly as one of the top 100 HR influencers of 2020, and his work has most recently been featured in the New York Times, Mashable, and Upworthy. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
To tell us a little bit about your backstory and how you ended up in this line of work. How did conversations become your calling? Jeff, let's start with you.
Sure. So mine is a really roundabout way. I saw the movie Big as a kid with Tom Hanks, and he was working and he was getting to play with toys for a living. And I was like, oh, I want to be in the toy industry. So I wrote toy companies until I got in 20 years later. And then I was actually in these toy companies. And a lot of them were not having quality conversations. They were not addressing really important issues. And I remember leaving, going to the Bay Area and growing like one of the largest Lego-inspired STEM organizations like in the US. And while we were doing that, we actually started running team building events for a lot of the companies that you mentioned earlier, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Adobes, the top tech companies in the world. And we found that at the same time they talked about disruption, innovation, risk taking, what the one thing they weren't doing was they were not allowing their staff to actually play and take risks the way in which they were speaking. And the reason why was they hadn't built psychologically safe workspaces where people could have difficult conversations and really connect as human beings.
I love how you see communication as this big sandbox, and I want to hear more about some of the activities that you engage. On tonight's show, we're talking about having difficult conversations even with someone who disagrees with you. Daryl Davis is a blues musician in Chicago with an interesting hobby. For the past 30 years, Davis, who is a black man, has spent time befriending members of the Ku Klux Klan. Since he started talking with them, he says 200 Klansmen have given up their robes. Davis collects them and keeps them at home as a reminder of the dent that he's made in racism simply by sitting down and having dinner with people. Now, how do we channel that little bit of Daryl Davis and all of us? How do you channel that patience, that empathy, that understanding, especially these days when we're so quick to cancel, dismiss, and hit delete? Now, Jeff, you recently had a 3-hour conversation with a Trump supporter. It's my understanding that you're not a Republican. Was that one of the most interesting or best conversations you ever had? And how did that feel for you?
It was humbling. I learned this from my friend Eric Bailey. You either go into a conversation to understand or you go into a conversation to be right. And she and I had to constantly check ourselves to be like, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to understand? Are we listening to respond? Or are we listening to actually really connect on an empathetic level with one another? And some of the biggest lessons I learned from just that conversation was first, like acknowledging other people's experience, even if you disagree with it, not conflating, where they stand with the single demographic and actually just being curious. What is it? I learned this from my friend Keisha, was saying, fear, the acronym for fear is like false evidence appearing real. And the reason why it was such a long conversation is we had to cut through all of the assumptions that we had and really question them and really try to connect with each other at a human level and realize like, oh, we have the same values. In many ways we do. We just have a different way in interpreting that. And then from there, from that foundation, then we could actually have a respectful conversation.
Now, it's interesting the point that you make about not conflating everyone into sort of a single demographic, because if you look at the way scientific experiments are conducted, for instance, you only take a sample to test a hypothesis and then you come to a general conclusion. So how do we stop ourselves from having our minds operate the same way? Do we acknowledge the fact that there are many outliers? Like, how do you go about doing that?
Well, I think we have to first ask ourselves, are we telling ourselves we're the hero of our own story, right? And how does that help us look good, right? Why is everyone else a villain in this story? When I'm working with a lot of companies, if you're focused on winning all the time, winning that conversation, then you're not ready to have that conversation. And I think, again, we have to come from a place of curiosity and also challenging our own rooted beliefs. I now speak more about, if you're so sure about something, the more sure you are about it, the more you should start actually questioning it to see if that really is the case, or is that just you telling that hero story so that everyone feels wrong while you feel right?
Sure, we're talking about how to have a difficult conversation with someone who disagrees with you. I want to start with you, Jeff. Jeff, you see the art of communication as being this great big sandbox, and that play can go a long way in terms of building trust and fostering inclusivity. Talk to us about some of the activities and exercises that you engage in to achieve those goals or outcomes.
Sure. So I see play as almost the opposite of perfection, and perfection is rooted in like ego and shame and scared of failure, while play is all about failure. It's all about experimentation. It's all about curiosity. It's all about like, let's try this out. So when I'm running a lot of these workshops, a lot of what we're doing is we're role playing, because if you think about work, we never get to practice. In the US, in NFL, we practice all week for a 3-hour game. But when it comes to work, like, we don't get to practice difficult conversations. We don't get to practice how to lead, how to manage. How many people do you know that are managers that never learned how to become a manager? So when are we going to have those conversations and actually sit in the awkwardness? So in the workshops we do, we actually role play out the workshop. If we're running a workshop on dealing with toxic people at work, it's just like, how would you say it? How would you talk to that person? How would you address their behavior and not attack their character? Here, let's do it again. Here, let's do it again. And then you start to see people being like, oh, you know what? This is not that bad. I can actually do this. And I think, tying back to what Ruth was saying earlier about what is this costing you? What is this costing your business? Studies from SHRM found that $223 billion were lost last year due to the last 5 years in Fortune 500 companies due to turnover because of a toxic person. So we're losing staff at an exponential rate. And when you're able to have a difficult conversation, you can create a psychologically safe workspace. And what are the benefits of that? Higher morale, higher productivity, lower turnover, higher revenue. So like this, there's a actual monetary value to having difficult conversations and creating that psychologically safe workspace.
I couldn't agree with you more. And by the way, I love your bow tie, very snappy.
I felt like I should dress up.
What are some of the stories that we tell ourselves, or that you've heard clients tell themselves, that get in the way of having those difficult conversations?
That it's not possible. That the old story that we believe, like, how many times have you heard from companies, oh, we've always done it this way, so we can't change, right? And like, that's the thing that we have to ask ourselves constantly. If you're a team leader watching this right now, ask yourself, how would you define your culture? Ask your staff, how would you define the culture? Because there's a lot of unwritten rules that we just assume people know when we actually haven't even had discussions around that. So we have to explore what are we doing that's not working? What are these unsaid assumptions that we have? And why are we not willing to get awkward, get uncomfortable, and knowing that we're going to make mistakes during this? Because I think a lot of times we're striving for perfection when it's just like, you're not going to have perfection. It's going to be a ton of mistakes. It's going to be really messy. Hey, guess what? That difficult conversation, it's not going to be one conversation and then everything's perfect. This is going to last 3 months, 6 months. But if we're willing to constantly come back to the table and be like, I'm here to understand you. I'm not here to be right. I'm here to actually understand. That's when we can all start to build back the community and build that psychological safety that we need in order for our company to thrive.
And I think what's key is you can't always do both. You can't always be right and listen to understand. Jeff, I want to talk to you about what are some fatal faux pas that we should steer clear from in a difficult conversation, whether it's in the workplace or maybe it's with family members who have different political points of view. I know that's especially the case in multi-generational families. You know, how do you let the other side see where they're coming from without dismissing their experience and their wisdom that led them to believe what they do?
I think that's the biggest one that you just said, denying their experience. I think we do that all the time. And when what do people want most? They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be loved.
Absolutely.
And when you are saying that actually did not happen to you, you believe this certain like political value, but actually everyone is brainwashed. What you're really saying to them is like, I don't see you, and I choose not to see you, and I don't see you as a human being. And like that's harsh. That hits you on the gut level. So I think we have to first be thinking about, all right, how am I going about having this conversation where my main goal is to walk away with a better understanding of you, not like that you have a better understanding of me and that you feel like I've won. I don't think anyone's ever had a conversation with someone where at the end of it, someone was like, you were right. Like, you're absolutely right, and I'm completely wrong. Like, that just doesn't happen. It's never happened ever that way. Yet we go into conversations believing that. And then I think tying back to what Ruth was saying earlier is we also have to look at what are our examples in the media of people actually navigating difficult conversations. Most of the time, people are just having speeches next to each other. That's all they're doing. They're just, I'm talking, then you're talking, then I'm talking, you're talking. And no one's actually trying to understand one another. And what we need to do instead is be willing to be like, all right, I'm going to stop inundating myself with media, because I think we get more information in a day from media than people in the 1950s got in an entire year. So this is constantly telling us what we need to hear or what we're supposed to believe, and instead actually go out. Like I did speaking to someone that, disagreed with me politically. We actually had this conversation for 3.5 hours. And what was the result of that? There were 1,000 people on YouTube watching it live, and a couple people even wrote that were like, I like this conversation. I like that you two are having this conversation. I think I'm going to reach out to someone I disagree with politically. And then it has that ripple effect that it's not that bad, and that we can actually heal the world one conversation at a time.
That's truly the way in which you see change. I absolutely agree with you. It sounds like empathy is one of the most important skills you can possibly have when entering a negotiation or a difficult conversation. And Jeff, you have a lot of great resources on your website. And one of the resources is talking about the 3 different layers of empathy. Talk to us about that and how that plays a role in your line of work.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of like the things that like tangibly are captured within empathy. And I think one of the best things you can do around difficult conversation is actually practice active listening. So that's actually reflecting back what that person has to say and really being like, oh, let me just reinterpret so that we're on the same page, right? So that's, I think, one of the first ones that's huge. Then another one regarding empathy is actually understanding where are they coming from? And then also, where are you coming from? What are your triggers? You should be going into a conversation knowing your triggers so that you know that when you're discussing this conversation with this person, you're not having a conversation from 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago, because many times we actually do a lot of that as well. And then thirdly, there is, what was the one that I really wanted to emphasize? But yeah, it is around trying to come from a standpoint of humility, and that we are working together to address this conflict. It's not that you're going against me and I'm going against you. It's that there's this conflict that's separate from us, but we're working together to address this conflict. So we're actually disassociating this from our own characters, and we're actually working together to address, as sometimes we do in my workshop, a scapegoat. We're going to blame the goat. Just keep blaming this absurd goat, because when you do something like that, you realize, like, oh my gosh, why am I so angry at this stuffed animal? Like, this is the way in which I am towards people, and I don't need to be this way. Like, let's take our egos out of it, and let's stop making it so serious and actually just try to connect from a human level.
I love the way how you encourage your audiences to look at the absurdity of the situation. I think we could all use a step back once in a while. We're unfortunately almost at the end of our time together, Jeff, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your website, some of the resources that are available, and how our audience can find you.
Absolutely. So you simply can go to rediscoveryourplay.com, click on the Let's Play button, where I have a bunch of resources on how to have difficult conversations. And then you can just hop on a phone call with me, and we can actually finally address how to create psychologically safe workspaces, especially in the post-pandemic world, because we're all about bringing more shared humanity back to work.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Ruth, Jeff, and Christine, for your time tonight and for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your observations on how to have a difficult conversation with someone, even if you disagree with them. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio tonight. We'll see you again at 8 p.m. next week. Have a great night.